if others will be coming or not, but let's make a start of it. So we are on, we've come to the final work of the course on Milton, the last work he wrote, and a major work in its own right, in which he deals with the ancient form of tragedy. And as he says right at the outset of this, it is has ever been held the gravest moralist and most profitable of all other poems, precisely because it raises pity and fear, or terror, and purges the mind of those. And it does so in accordance with the principle of homeopathic medicine to this day. You give a little bit of the dog, little hair of the dog that bit you. So if you so for poisons, the antidote will be a little bit of that poison, actually, not the opposite of it, but the same thing itself. So it's an inoculation. So we visit terror and pity upon you in the drama, so that when you face such things yourself, you're not thereby cowed, terrified, rendered inert. So it has a moral effect. That's Milton's explanation of it. It's actually not Milton's explanation, it's Aristotle's explanation. So in his Poetics, I believe book 6, yes, it says there, speaking of the principle of catharsis. Catharsis means a purging. So it's not that we indulge in it and take any delight in it, rather it is that by giving us something of that, we are to some degree less vulnerable to it. And if you think about the power of I'm teaching this course concurrently with the Tolkien-Lewis course. Gandalf says that the chief weapon of the enemy is fear, and therefore courage is needed for the moral life and for the Christian life. And there are all manner of varieties of courage. There's courage in battle, which Milton is explicitly repudiated in Paradise Lost as something that he is really interested in as a Christian, although it's not the courage that he disavows, it's rather the idea of a physical enemy that needs to be defeated. That doesn't mean that courage isn't needed, and it's courage against the very things that we saw in Paradise Regained that Jesus was resistant to and showed temperance. So he was resistant to the lust of the flesh. So he needed courage in a sense, in the face of his hunger, his bodily weakness. He was also needed courage to combat the inner temptation of the lust of the eye, which are related to his kingship, as we saw. So his desire to fulfill God's will by becoming the rightful heir of David, which he knew he was, and seizing power and helping everyone precisely by doing that. That was the temptation that was put to him. It wouldn't have been a temptation that we would have to nearly the same degree, because it was his right to take the throne of David. It was prophesied that it would be his son, and it would be this, and he knew that he was in fact the one intended by this. So in some sense that's a real temptation for him, in the way that power is not for us. So more fully the case with Jesus. And then finally, the pride of life, the vanity of trying to fulfill God's kingdom here on earth without getting rid of sin and death, and getting glory for it. And the Son above all things deserves glory, and would get glory if he fought against flesh and blood and not against the spiritual forces arrayed against him. And in order to achieve that glory, he had to follow the most inglorious path imaginable, namely the path of the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. So that was the means that the Son received glory, through the indignity and the humiliation of the crucifixion. So all of these things were his way of, they were sorts of courage in which he had to temper his desire for the things that were offered, which were legitimate, but were the wrong means. They went around the cross. They went directly for the thing that was offered. So similarly in Samson Agonistes, when it is speaking of purging pity and fear or terror, it does so by showing how Samson, who is a supernaturally strong figure, will be made blind in chains and become the deliverer that God has promised of Israel in his own self-destruction. And in so doing, he's a type of Christ, which I think is Milton's point. And many have commentated, of course, that Samson himself has similarities to Milton himself because of his blindness, because of the probably the destruction of his own sense of vocation. So Cromwell's government, with their post-millennial eschatological hopes that they were founding a kingdom that would usher in the coming and reign of Christ, was now in absolute tatters. Cromwell was dead, the Republic was ended, Milton was under house arrest, he was blind and helpless, threatened on all sides. And then he writes these three grand epics, exalting the paradise within, and the way in which God does not require us to be victorious in order for him to work. He works through even through our weakness. So it's an inversion of heroism, and in some ways it is to some degree a reflection on Milton's own experiences. But he argues that it's a true reading of the biblical message as well. Fascinating stuff. In the introduction, I find it really interesting that he raises the use of classical works and addresses it explicitly in a way he doesn't in the epic. Namely, that he uses a classical type or genre of literature as a Christian, and some might object to his use of them. And so he gives a lengthy apologetic for using Greek literature as explicitly as he does. Now note that the subject matter is Hebrew. It's about one of the judges, Samson. But the genre is a very well-reputed Greek mode of literature. And for Milton, there have been nobody has superseded the original Greek dramatists. So Euripides and Sophocles, and who's the third? Aeschylus. Yes, pardon me. These three of the Attic dramatists are considered to be without peer, and he says this having read Shakespeare's dramas. So that's interesting. I mean, his tragedies, rather. He's well acquainted with Shakespeare. He's seen Shakespeare's tragedies performed, no doubt. And he regards Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides as unequaled, nonetheless. That's what he says at the end of the introduction here. So that is very interesting. But he says he has chosen it because of its high seriousness. Now, that is somewhat at odds with the reason that he chose the subject matter of his epics. The epic matter that he chose was to obtain answerable style. It answers various questions. It almost has an apologetic dimension to it. And so he attunes the literary form to the context of what he's writing about. In the one case, the fall of mankind. In the second case, the temptation of Christ. But it's trying to answer certain questions, and so it adapts the form very much to that. This one, he is writing more or less a tragedy, without a great deal of alteration, and so maybe this is why he speaks about the use of the Greek tragic form without so much of an adaptation. And so instead of that, he cites precedent for this. Various of the ancient writers, including Augustus Caesar, who tried to write a tragedy, and Seneca the philosopher. But he also mentions Gregory Nazianzen, one of the Eastern fathers, who wrote a tragedy called Christ's Suffering, interestingly. Very interesting. So, without further ado, the argument he gives, and again, he gives these at the outset, very interesting. By the way, I think this is what we would call a closet drama. It's not meant to be portrayed on the stage. I've never seen it portrayed on the stage. I'm not sure quite how it would be depicted on the stage. It takes place in Milton's mind's eye. So there isn't a lot of thought to the staging and performance. So if you look, it's characteristic of the period, but even still, there's no reference to scenes or the settings, or very little by way of that. Very, very little. But there is an argument at the outset. So Samson, and the one thing I will say finally about it, and he mentions this right at the end of his introduction, it follows Aristotle's recommendation that a good tragedy, of which Oedipus, the king, is the prime example for Aristotle, ought to take place within a very short space of time, ideally 24 hours, and this takes place within that condensed period. So as the 18th century critics will say, there's a unity of time and place and actors. So it doesn't take place over weeks and months and years. It doesn't take place with a broad range of characters like Tolstoy's War and Peace, where you're being introduced to so many names that you lose track of them. And it's not taking place in different continents all over the place. So it's a confined space of time with a confined group of individuals in a space, a unified space. That's the best way of expressing this. Milton follows that recommendation. So Samson is made captive. By the way, Samson, you would know this already, but Samson is one of the judges of Israel, or deliverers, of which there were many. But he is rather unique in amongst the judges, insofar as Israel has not called him per se. He has been called by God, and specifically twice by angels. He's been heralded by angels. Now think about this. Who else is heralded by angels? Twice. Think about it. In Scripture. Christ. Right? So there's something special about this particular judge. Many of the judges are in the book of Judges I would say there's a similarity in the way that they seek to fulfill their office. Samson is unique insofar as he individually, in his person, seems to attract the attention of the Philistines, and it's almost like he's drawing away the wrath of the Philistines from the people of God, bringing it upon himself. So in that sense, an anticipation of Christ as well. So rather than the wrath being inflicted upon the Israelites, it's being inflicted upon the man. And there's an alliance of all sides, including his own people, against him. So in all of these senses, Samson is almost a type of Christ. And Milton's argument, if we take it as such, is that this typology of suffering, which we see in Samson and in Christ, is also true of every Christian, to some degree. Not to the same power and extent, but to some degree, suffering goes with the Christian life. And there's a need for courage in the midst of the threats, and perseverance, just as Milton himself has had to do. Not that he sees himself as a Christ figure or anything like that. Note that there's no commentary on himself there. He writes a sonnet on his blindness, and there are passages in which he refers to his blindness, but he is not the subject matter of any of his poems, his lengthy poems at any rate. So we're not supposed to see this as some sort of psychological projection, the way modern scholars tend to see. They see anything that an artist has written as a psychological projection of sorts. It's a Freudian view of art, more or less. My inner life put out on the page. My biography expressed in my work. There's warrant for it on one level, but Milton clearly does not want us to see that way. Or if it is that way, it's because he says it's true of every Christian experience, which is exactly what Dante says as well in the Divine Comedy. Right? That's why he says, in the middle of the journey of our lives, he says. The nostra vita, of our life, not just his life. He finds himself lost. So Samson is captive, blind, and now in the prison at Gaza. Here's where we meet him. First, there to labor as in a common workhouse on a festival day in the general cessation from labor, comes forth into the open air to a place nigh, somewhat retired, there to sit a while and bemoan his condition, where he happens at length to be visited by certain friends and equals of his tribe, which make the chorus, who seek to comfort him what they can. Then by his old father Manoah, who endeavors the like, and withal tells him his purpose to procure his liberty by ransom. So he wants to help him. Lastly, that this feast was proclaimed by the Philistines as a day of thanksgiving for their deliverance from the hands of Samson, which yet more troubles him. Manoah then departs to prosecute his endeavor with the Philistine lords for Samson's redemption, who in the meanwhile is visited by other persons, and lastly by a public officer to require his coming to the feast before the lords and people, to play or show his strength in their presence. He at first refuses, dismissing the public officer with absolute denial to come. At length, persuaded inwardly that this was from God, he yields to go along with him, who came now with the second time with great threatenings to fetch him, the chorus yet remaining on the place. Manoah returns full of joyful hope to ransom his son, and finds that his son is going to be the ransom. So there's a play on the ransom here. The Manoah, his father, wants to ransom his son. The son is going to ransom not only his father, but the people of Israel, and he's going to do so by paying with his own life. And he's going to bring along with him the whole of the leadership of the Philistines and the cult of Dagon, the fish god, who is worshipped in the temple of the Philistines and in the neighboring regions. So in the midst of which discourse, an Hebrew comes in haste, confusedly at first and afterwards more distinctly, relating the catastrophe that Samson had done to the Philistines, and by accident to himself, wherewith the tragedy ends. And note, it is by accident. Milton calls it an accident. Of course, we will see it rather differently. This is God's providence, and Samson thereby becomes a type of Christ. But he did not seek to take his own life, was the point. Just happened. So the form, as I say, is of Greek tragedy. It takes case in the context for Milton as well of a military defeat, the return of Charles II from exile, the restoration of the monarchy, and along with it, the restoration of a strongly sympathetic king towards Catholicism, put it mildly, which will end years later in the Glorious Revolution. But at first, it's the restoration of a Catholic monarch. So there's the blinding, the military defeat, the blinding of Samson, and all of this is, of course, is like Milton, rather, which is, of course, like Samson. And yet there is a light within him that ennobles him to perform the task before him, which is now drudgery. Like at first he's performing terrific feats of physical strength. Now he's been reduced to pushing a grinding device to grind grain. He's acting like a beast. My notes suggest that this is like Milton listening to parliamentary procedures. The grind